The room is applauding. 500 people, black tie, champagne. Gerald Ratner stands at the podium of the Institute of Directors at the Royal Albert Hall, and he is the most powerful jeweler in the world. He opens his mouth. 10 seconds later, £500 million begins to disappear. That is not a metaphor. That is not an exaggeration dressed up for television. One sentence, spoken in jest, would detonate the largest retail jewelry empire Britain had ever built and reduce its architect to near bankruptcy within 18 months. This is the story of how a single joke became the most expensive punchline in corporate history. Gerald Ratner did not inherit a throne. He was handed a shaky stool and told to make it work. His father, Leslie Ratner, had founded a small jewelry chain in the 1940s. By the time Gerald joined the family business in the early 1960s, it was modestly successful, a few shops, respectable turnover, nothing spectacular. Gerald started at the bottom, learning the shop floor, the stock rooms, the particular rhythms of selling rings and chains to working-class customers who saved up for months to buy something that would last a lifetime. He understood those customers. Not in an abstract, boardroom way. In the way you understand people when you have stood across a glass counter from them 5 days a week. But the business was struggling when Gerald took the helm as chief executive in 1984. The chain had around 130 stores and was, by any honest assessment, floundering. The question was what to do with it. His answer was radical in its simplicity. Instead of competing with the upmarket jewelers on Bond Street, he would go the other direction entirely. He would make jewelry so cheap, so accessible, so aggressively priced, that ordinary people who had never walked into a jewelry shop feeling welcome, would flood through his doors. He would sell a 9-carat gold ring for under a tenner. He would put a pair of earrings at 99 pence. He would strip out the velvet curtain pretension of the jewelry trade and replace it with bright lights, high volume, and price tags that made people blink. It worked spectacularly, almost frightening in how well it worked. Through the mid to late 1980s, Ratner's expanded at a pace that left competitors scrambling. He acquired H. Samuel. He bought Ernest Jones. He crossed the Atlantic and purchased the American chain Kay Jewelers, then Zales, two of the most recognized jewelry brands in the United States. By 1990, the Ratner Group operated over 2,500 stores across the UK, the US, and beyond. Annual turnover was in the hundreds of millions. The group employed over 25,000 people. Gerald Ratner was worth an estimated £500 million. He had done it in under a decade. At his peak, Ratner was not just a rich man, he was a symbol proof that you could come from nowhere, ignore the establishment's rules, and build something genuinely enormous. He was photographed, profiled, celebrated. He drove a Porsche. He owned a house in Kensington. He traveled on Concorde. He was invited to Downing Street. He golfed with the powerful and dined with the famous. This was the 1980s, and Gerald Ratner fit the era like a bespoke suit, bold, brash, unapologetically prosperous. Inside the business, the numbers were extraordinary. Ratner's sold 1 in 4 of all jewelry items purchased in Britain. Think about that for a moment. Every 4 pieces of jewelry that changed hands somewhere in the United Kingdom, one of them passed through a Ratner store. The group was shifting roughly 2 million pieces of jewelry per week at its height. 2 million. The efficiency was remarkable, low cost, high volume, fast turnover, relentless expansion. But here, quietly, beneath the gleaming surface of those numbers, there were things that warranted attention. The American acquisitions had cost a great deal and were carrying significant debt. The retail environment in the early 1990s was beginning to tighten. Interest rates in Britain had climbed sharply, consumer confidence was wobbling, and the post-Thatcher economic boom was showing signs of strain. The Ratner Group's balance sheet was not fragile, but it was not bulletproof either. And there was something else. A tension that had been simmering for years inside Ratner himself, a tension between the empire he had built and his private feelings about what it sold. Because Gerald Ratner was not naive about his products, he knew exactly what they were. The 9-carat gold rings, the sherry decanters, the affordable earrings, they were not heirlooms. They were not investments. They were inexpensive goods, cheerfully produced, cheerfully priced, sold to people who wanted something sparkly without paying Bond Street prices. There is nothing wrong with any of that. Millions of people wanted exactly that. That was the entire business model, and it had worked. But Ratner had a habit of saying the quiet part loud. In private, among friends, at dinners, he had reportedly joked about his own merchandise for years. It was a kind of self-deprecating humor, the businessman poking fun at himself. Look at me, selling sherry decanters to the masses. People laughed. It stayed in the room. Until April 23, 1991. The Institute of Directors' annual conference at the Royal Albert Hall was one of the most prestigious business events on the British calendar. 5,000 directors and executives, the cream of British corporate leadership, gathered to hear speeches and be addressed by people who had made it. Gerald Ratner had made it. He was the keynote. He had spoken at events like this before. He was known as an engaging, energetic speaker, charismatic, sometimes irreverent. He was not a stiff man in a stiff suit reading from prepared remarks. He had personality. He liked a laugh. He had prepared a speech. It covered the business, the growth, the American expansion. It was, by accounts, competent and positive. But Gerald Ratner was the kind of speaker who liked to go off script when the room was warm. And the room was warm. He reached a moment in his speech where he was talking about the low prices Ratners charged. Why, he asked rhetorically, could they sell a pair of earrings for under £1? And then, leaning into the microphone, with 5,000 people watching and journalists with notepads in the room, he answered his own question. Because, he said, they were total crap. The room laughed. He continued. He mentioned a Ratner's sherry decanter, the kind sold with glasses, the complete set, a classic gift item, and compared it, favorably or otherwise, to a prawn sandwich from Marks and Spencer. The sandwich, he suggested, would probably last longer. The room laughed again. Ratner smiled. The speech moved on. The evening continued. He went home. He did not know what was coming. The journalists in that room had their story, not the one about expansion and turnover and American acquisitions. The other story, the one where the man who had sold 100 million pieces of jewelry to the British public stood up and called his own products total crap. By the next morning, it was on the front pages. The Sun, the Mirror, the tabloids who could sense the velocity of a story like this, they ran it hard. RATNER, our jewels are crap. RATNER calls his own products rubbish. The headlines wrote themselves. The public reacted with the speed and force of something that had been waiting to happen. Not fury, exactly, something colder, embarrassment, the feeling of being laughed at. Millions of people had bought gifts at Ratner's, engagement rings, anniversary presents, things they had saved for, things they had given with love. Those gifts now had a different feeling. The man who sold them had stood in a hall full of rich people and called them crap. Whether that was fair or not, whether it was a joke or not, did not matter. The feeling was real. Footfall dropped, not gradually, immediately. Within days, customers were walking past Ratner stores rather than into them. Sales began to fall off a cliff edge. The press, smelling blood, kept the story alive. Every day, new coverage. The joke replayed in print, on radio, in the early morning television news. There was no way to stop it and no obvious way to respond. Ratner apologized. He clarified. He explained that it was a joke, that it was self-deprecating humor taken out of context, that he had enormous respect for his customers. None of it landed. The image was set. In the public mind, Gerald Ratner had said what he thought. Everything after that sounded like a man trying to unsay something that could not be unsaid. The share price began to fall. Investors, already nervous about the debt load from the American acquisitions and the softening retail environment, now had a reputational catastrophe to factor in. The Ratner Group had been valued at around £680 million at its peak. Within weeks of the speech, the share price had fallen by almost 80%. The market capitalization collapse was catastrophic, roughly £500 million in value erased. Suppliers grew nervous. Lenders tightened. The board, which had celebrated Ratner's growth for years, began to look at him differently. The company held on through 1991 and into 1992, but it was holding on the way a man holds a wall for balance, technically upright, but not walking anywhere. Sales continued to suffer. The American operations were bleeding money. The group was carrying debt it had been serviceable before April 23rd. After April 23rd, with revenue under sustained pressure, it looked different. In November 1992, Gerald Ratner resigned as chairman. He had no meaningful stake left. His personal wealth, derived from shares in the company, had effectively been destroyed along with the share price. The man who had been worth £500 million was, within 18 months of a single speech, facing the prospect of selling his home in Kensington to cover debts. He did sell it. He sold the Porsche. He moved his family to a smaller house. He was not destitute, but he was, by any reasonable measure, finished as the force he had been. The company itself was renamed. The Ratner name, once ubiquitous on every high street, was stripped from the stores. The parent group eventually became Signet Jewelers, which still operates today as one of the world's largest jewelry retailers. The empire survived, in a different form, under a different name, without the man who built it. Consider that for a moment. The business lived. The name died. Gerald Ratner built something large enough to outlast him, but was personally consumed by the collapse of its reputation. He was 42 years old when he resigned. He spent several years in what he has described as a genuine depression. The jokes that kept coming, the doing a Ratner phrase that entered British business vocabulary, shorthand for catastrophic self-sabotage through public candor, those did not help. To have your name become a synonym for corporate suicide while you are still alive and reading newspapers is a particular kind of wound. But Ratner came back, slowly, quietly, without the fanfare of the Royal Albert Hall. He began investing in health clubs in the late 1990s, small operations, nothing like the old empire but real business. He sold those profitably. He began speaking at corporate events, which required a particular kind of courage. The man whose speech destroyed his fortune now giving speeches about it. He turned the story into a lesson, and he told it honestly. He did not pretend the joke was fine. He did not pretend it was purely the media's fault. He owned it, in the way you can only own something after you have had years to sit with it. He has written about it. He has spoken about it. He eventually launched an online jewelry business, GeraldRatner.com, in 2012, and notably it succeeded. Not at the scale of the old empire, but it succeeded. He sold it in 2022 at a profit, ending a chapter that had begun, in its darkest form, 30 years earlier. What is left after everything is a story that is harder to dismiss than it looks. Gerald Ratner did not commit fraud. He did not steal. He did not build his empire on deception or exploit his workers or manipulate the markets. He built a business that genuinely served millions of people who wanted affordable jewelry, and he built it better than almost anyone had before him. The thing that destroyed him was a joke. 10 seconds, one sentence, the wrong words, in the wrong room, with the wrong people holding pens. There is a version of this story where you laugh, where you say, what did he expect? But there is another version, equally true, where you feel something more uncomfortable, because the joke Gerald Ratner told was not really a lie. The products were cheap. That was the whole point. That was why people bought them. Cheap and cheerful and accessible for people who could not afford expensive things but still wanted something to give. The moment he said it out loud in a formal setting, the social contract cracked. Not because the information was new, but because the pretense, the mutual, comfortable pretense that cheap things are not cheap, was broken. Business runs, often, on carefully maintained illusions of worth. Ratner accidentally named the illusion, and the system punished him for it with extraordinary severity. £500 million, 5,000 people in an audience, 10 seconds. The numbers, as they always do in stories like this, tell you the scale. But they do not tell you the thing that stays with you, the image of a man who built an empire serving millions of ordinary people, who cracked one joke in a room full of powerful ones, and who spent the next decade quietly building something smaller and more honest out of the wreckage. What you do with that is up to you.